So where do we stand on Thunderdome, a film that is accused of departing from the first two features, being too Americanized or otherwise too fantastical, too Peter Pan, too lighthearted, just inferior generally, but also which some may claim is the most compelling of the three due to a lack of attachment toward them in general, maybe. Thunderdome is not very Mad Max, as we understood it, but it remained very George Miller. It leans into what was unique about Mad Max 2, Road Warrior, compared with the first film, and explores this territory rather than the cut realism of the prior two entries. Not that Beyond Thunderdome is without horror, violence, and cutthroat post-apocalyptic realities, although the Jungian fantasia reigns supreme, to the point wherein a seemingly supernatural or otherwise ghostly presence is almost overtly implied during the film's second half. Yeah, we can appreciate Thunderdome as Miller continuing to explore a unique vision with which to cast his now iconic character, and his creative priorities are so fascinating, they aren't obnoxiously cliched, and if they seem that way, they are arranged via a bizarre rationale, an Australian's outsider's rationale for appreciating otherwise Hollywood-esque or English Arthurian slash St. Georgian scaffolds. He isn't trying to copy anything or anyone, just a stream of consciousness series of events which have a certain linear relevance inherent to the fact that Miller imagined them. He sees a connection between the events which are not literal but rather aesthetic. He is a filmmaker of an ancient storytelling tradition and potentially a futuristic forward-thinking creative philosophy also. I consider Beyond Thunderdome to be a third masterpiece within the trilogy, my least favourite of the three, and when we expand the series to a quadrilogy, it is still my least favourite, although it has boundless merits, and I would admittedly like it a lot more if it were the only Mad Max film, the only picture to contain the distinct qualities of this series, even if it were the only one of the first three, even. So, scene by scene, this applies to Thunderdome too, and like the first two films, every scene is a great scene, which makes the Mad Max trilogy superior to the original Star Wars trilogy. Not every scene in Return of the Jedi is a great scene. No scene of Ewoks is a great scene by default, except for Yub Nub, of course. Of course. Oh, Tina Turner's presence and two accompanying songs define this film in every respect, a constant metaphor of the American involvement, appeal, and borrowed aesthetic, but also of where Australia idealised, more than Americans had, their unique capacity for Jungian icons. Who's this Jung? Some commie, was he? Australia sometimes praises. Perhaps the Tina Turner connection is Miller appeasing his desire to have composed a rock film titled Roxanne after the first Mad Max before embarking upon the second picture instead. Rock elements weave their way into Mad Max 2's costume designs, although this could also be interpreted as a logical extension of the first film. Tina Turner's presence as an arena rock diva queen and MTV video dictator has Beyond Thunderdome feel more like the ultimate American-Australian rapport aesthetic piece, a two-way feedback loop of what the two countries admire about the other's creative culture, perhaps. Anyway, the two songs Turner provides for the opening and closing credits, they indicate how Mad Max has become a recognized American blockbuster prospect, one of those films you're willing to watch a sequel to in the early to mid-1980s. To some extent, Australia had embraced some American popular culture in the 80s and loved the attention given back to us via Road Warrior, Mel Gibson, Men at Work, and eventually Crocodile Dundee, or In Excess. Yikes, the latter few examples aren't so prestigious, but they were around. Beyond Thunderdome, or Turner's presence, which is inescapable from any discussion or reference to Beyond Thunderdome itself, obviously wants to be even more elevated and mainstream and unifying than Road Warrior, and it didn't see this as a bad thing, maybe even the logical next step. Also, think of this as the search for Spock to Wrath of Khan, or just Jedi to Empire. Road Warrior hinted at the relevance and validity of hope in the irradiated raceland. Beyond Thunderdome celebrates and champions it as the most viable strategy for survival and recovery in such an environment. The humanity which Max had restored via the Jara Captain, Papagello, and the Feral Kid, and the others in the tanker colony, comes full circle as he knowingly sacrifices his life, or so he assumes. Did he anticipate Auntie's impressed mercy prior? To ensure the safe passage of the left tribe with the pilot and his son, not feeling any need to seek revenge on the pilot, knowing, one, he is their last hope, but also that if Max had never pursued the pilot, a shameless thief of Max's belongings, he would have eventually come across the left tribe, and they would have been waiting there for the alleged Captain Walker forever. Max's presence initially caused distress, but then did enable their salvation via a roundabout, potentially or definitely prophetic sort of fashion, even. And so in embracing such classical or now Hollywood cliches, Miller embraced the Australian-American relationship, seeing it as global, universal, iconic, timeless, a piece of narrative fiction, and a means of going even further than Road Warrior had, and some may claim it did. I'd be interested in listening or reading the case that some have for liking Beyond Thunderdome the most. I imagine they would be identifying a higher spiritual, archetypal realm which Thunderdome is excelling at, which those who sooner prioritize or prefer the first two films, or even now Fury Road or Furiosa, are taking still for granted, perhaps. Anyway, onto the scene by scene, finally. Among the world of the living gets one hyped, but they also think, uh-oh, we went from Brian May's extraordinary work to some pop rock arena track over the opening credits. Uh-oh, this might be a bit more cliche 80s than we would like. And in a respect it is, but it does the most with cliche 80s, we could claim anyway. And the rest of the music is provided by Maurice Jarre, and it is totally brilliant and seemingly underrated. Spots of didgeridoos, clanging percussion, uplifting melodies, varied, catching, memorable, and immersive. A very underrated score in the grand scheme of film scores, honestly. Miller having Ogilvy co-direct is not because he wanted a creative collaborator, though he did. That person was co-screenwriter Terry Hayes, also off of Road Warrior's screenplay earlier, but wanting another person to help him direct the production in a manner that was more hands-on than a second unit or assistant director. Think about Lucas hiring Kirshner or Marquand for Jedi, or enlisting Spielberg for the Indiana Jones films. But Miller wanted to be so hands-on in the film's visuals, composition, and motion in a manner not simply to be relegated to post-production analysis, as Star Wars, to a larger extent than Mad Max films, lends itself to, is what it is. That he couldn't just produce the film and ghost direct either, as Lucas had for Empire, Jedi, or the Indiana Jones features. Miller wasn't in the mood to direct after the tragic, untimely death of producer and his very good friend Byron Kennedy, who had created the series with Miller, producing both previous entries. So he asked his mate George Ogilvy, both having recently worked together directing an Australian TV miniseries known as The Dismissal, about what any Australian would assume it is about, and so Miller was able to acquire his services for the Beyond Thunderdome project. How do you think of an opening scene like this? A plane, camels, a long-haired Max, a uniquely visual, cinematic intro, not inducive to a literary composition. It lends itself to a cinematic imagination. A novelist or comic book writer may not have ever considered opening their tale like this, although a screenwriter or writer-director absolutely could, or at least one with the imaginative elasticity of George Miller, of course. Max's entry to Bartertown is threefold. First, he is in line. Then he is given his time with Frank Fring's The Collector, one of the best performances and characters in the series, potentially the most underrated too. And then they wander through Bartertown itself on their way to meet Auntie Entity, accompanied with one of Jarre's finest works for this film's score. Note Angry Anderson, very memorable and well costumed as Iron Bar Bassi, the new muscle henchman to replace Bubba or Wes. Anderson does a superb job and is clearly having a totally grand old time. I never would have expected to like anything the man does, given his fronting one of Australia's worst and most popular rock bands, the violently mediocre and lowest common denominator beer depression misery that is Rose's unambitious tattoo, and then in his weirdo 2000s dad politics of the 21st century. People my age know exactly what I mean, if you're Australian at least. He was a rebel and a rocker back in the day. Hadley Jones listener, oh, I didn't think they'd bring in that many migrants by the time they were parents settling down in the most eastern of Western Sydney suburbs, as west as they can get if they can try. Anyway, one of the great fantasy/genre productions of the 1980s. Forget this is a potentially tonally traitorous sequel to two distinct works. On its own, this is a major accomplishment, I think, by anyone's standards. Maybe. One of the great character introductions is Tina Turner's Auntie Entity. I really like this character, or at least what they were going for. I find her to be a positive step in the direction of empowered female roles in male or boy-oriented Hollywood films. I don't know how the feminist dimension feels. I like to consider myself a part of that. I hate men too, but they won't have me, historically, nor do they want me, so good for them. But I consider their bloc a net ally in spite of their occasionally baffling priorities, frankly. Anyway, she's not defined by being a woman, although is inescapably a woman, inescapably a branch of feminine behaviour, a matriarchal free enterprise optimist. The genre film's answer to the dismal caricatures of Easton Ellis or Oliver Stone prior to Mamet's finer realisation of these characteristics within the male realm during 1992's Glengarry Glen Ross then. Underworld, Master Blaster, the other brain and henchman of this film, and equally memorable, one of the most original ideas for an antagonistic role in the history of the medium, as is the action set piece of Thunderdome itself, generally ridiculous in idea, and then execution, as it may be. How Thunderdome is about the fundamental attributes of human societies, all encompassing metaphors for our seemingly more complicated neoliberal free market, makes me consider it vaguely more ambitious as a screenplay than the previous two films, as far as either social satire or speculative allegories are concerned, anyhow. The Thunderdome sequence itself is a tad insane, a tad ridiculous, utterly memorable, and heartbreakingly tragic. A bold move, and it is, I think, potentially important to show the inane tragedy behind violence and action set pieces within these genre films, as it is younger people who are watching them, they ought to know the other side of these fight scenes or this violent behaviour. It is good and well meaning of Miller to have Blaster be revealed as a mentally challenged adult manipulated by an overconfident but ultimately caring older brother, the fascinating, melancholic Master, one of the film's most sympathetic characters in the end, possibly. Mags is exiled for having broken a deal and for disrespecting the laws of Thunderdome, banned from the city of Bartertown. How Miller effortlessly dresses his film with unique, distinct, bizarre, idiosyncratic visuals, he is in a class of his own, apparently. Semler's cinematography is extraordinary. Who will argue? Beautiful Blue Mountains location filming here, this sequence of the tribe is completely enchanting, to me anyway. Semler captures the space of this place beautifully, magically, seamlessly. The plain in the desert is a stellar image also. Max follows some deserters who have run off into the desert. They are so far from the planet Earth oasis that they must seek some refuge and resources via sneaking into the despicable Bartertown. Max realizes they have no other choice. They steal a vehicle from Underworld here. And it's with the help of someone called the Pig Killer, who I used to assume was implied to be one of Captain Walker's crew, one of those who left to find supplies and help, leaving the younger ones in safety at the Planet Earth Oasis location, or the Blue Mountains. And the kid, he makes eye contact with and causes him to grin. I used to assume that was meant to be his child, and they actually recognized one another there. Apparently, it was not necessarily meant to be the case, but I prefer that angle. So to me, the pig killer was one of Captain Walker's crew who never returned because he tried to steal or kill a pig to take back to the oasis for food. Didn't work out, obviously. The train breaks through, busts up Bartertown. What follows is one of the greatest chases and sequences in Mad Max history, a touch underrated, we could even say. And then the hold up at the end of the tracks, like that child pushing the sumo wrestler, you remember that photograph. From there, Max cleverly secures the group and escape, costing him his own survival maybe, but Auntie cannot bring herself to kill him. She's too impressed, both with his skills and his bold humanity. He's on his own, but he has a vehicle, and that's all he needs. just like at the end of Road Warrior, but with a certain smile on his face, as opposed to the bittersweet smirk he gives the Jarrah captain at the close of that prior film. I like to think that Sydney wasn't irradiated, but had descended into chaos during the pre-apocalypse, pre-bombs energy crisis, and so the city remains intact and irradiated, but empty, and so the left tribe, along with the captain, his boy, inhabit and eventually repopulate the city, acquire the kids still at the planet Earth oasis, and I like to think maybe even Max came to settle there eventually too. But it is better for that to remain ambiguous, I also think. We don't need another hero. I agree with Tina on this. Hate it, love it, like it, indifferent to it. Thunderdome was one of the most distinct, original, bold, and imaginative blockbuster heroic narrative cycles in the history of fictional filmmaking, on a caliber of European or South American or East Asian ethereal fantasias, with the character of more English language, post-Arthurian realizations of Homeric sequences, profoundly influenced and imbued, then and now, via Hollywood storytelling and production logistics, inevitably. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, also a masterpiece, or so thinks AOD.